Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here for today's expert briefing. My name is John Thompson. I'm the Science Services Manager at the California Council on Science and Technology. I'd like to open up our briefing today by acknowledging that we're calling in from different locations in what we now call the state of California, which is home to many indigenous communities that have stewarded this land since time immemorial. For those of you who don't know us, the California Council on Science and Technology, or CCST, is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization established over 35 years ago at the request of the legislature. We were created to provide science and technology advice from the wealth of amazing academic and research institutions in the state, and connect that directly to policymakers. California is lucky to have such an incredible network of expertise, and our job at CCST is to help amplify and translate the expertise in this network into actionable advice for policymakers. We do this through a number of mechanisms, including briefings like the one you're attending today. We host workshops, write peer-reviewed reports, and run the CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, where we place PhD scientists and engineers in the executive branch and the legislature for a year of government service and leadership training. As part of our mission, CCST is advancing work related to our disaster resilience initiative to help the state better prepare for and respond to ongoing, complex, and intersecting disasters that affect public health, our economy, and our environment. These include climate change, extreme heat, wildfire, and power outages, all of which have and are radically disrupting the ways in which Californians live and work. Through our disaster resilience initiative, we seek to deliver science and technology advice to reduce harm and improve the lives of all Californians now and looking into the future. Today, we're going to be talking about a simple question. What if we treated our natural systems, forests, wetlands, working landscapes, the same way we treat other infrastructure? To help us answer that question, we're excited to be presenting this briefing in partnership with the Stanford Natural Capital Alliance, which is celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. And they'll be having a big research symposium next week. So to get that conversation started, I'd like to now introduce our moderator, Jenn Phillips. Jenn is the Assistant Secretary for Climate Change at the California Natural Resources Agency, where she helps lead the agency's work on climate adaptation, nature-based solutions, and international engagement. She's formerly a senior policy advisor with the U.S. Climate Alliance, where she supported a bipartisan coalition of U.S. states on their resilience and natural and working lands policy priorities. Prior to that, she worked for the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the California Ocean Protection Council. She was previously a Canals Marine Policy Fellow and key staff to the NOAA Administrator in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Jenn. I'll hand it off to you to take it away.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And as you teed up so well, I'm really excited to help moderate this conversation today. So as we all know on this line, California is no stranger to climate extremes. In recent years, the state's faced record-breaking heat, catastrophic wildfires, severe flooding, deepening drought, and accelerating coastal erosion. This constantly changing risk environment really challenges us across California and challenges us to continuously evaluate our approach to how we protect our communities and invest in public resources. As John said, today's briefing is asking a simple but very critical question. What if we treated nature the way we treat infrastructure? Roads, levees, water treatment plants show up in capital budgets, maintenance plans, and risk assessments. Forests, wetlands, floodplains, and coastal marshes may not, even though they often provide the same functions and sometimes do so more reliably and at a lower cost. The framework we're going to be digging into today will be exploring this question. The Natural Capital Assessments and Accounting Framework is a way of bridging this gap. It gives us tools to measure what nature provides, quantify what we lose when it degrades, and make the case for investment in ecological systems as a form of strategic infrastructure planning. Our panelists today represent some of the leading thinkers in this space, with expertise spanning ecosystem services management and modeling, the intersections of nature and public health, and the water, energy, food ecosystem nexus in rivers and watersheds. I'm really excited to hear from them and have you all learn from them over the next hour. So now I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves, and then we'll dig in on questions and conversation. First up is Lisa Mandle. She is the co-executive director of the Natural Capital Alliance at Stanford University. Lisa, over to you.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks to CCST for the opportunity to be here. As Jen said, I'm a co-executive director of the Natural Capital Alliance. We were formerly known as the Natural Capital Project. So if you're familiar with that group, we are one and the same. The Natural Capital Alliance is a collaboration across research and practitioner organizations centered at Stanford University, where I'm based, that advances science, technology, and partnerships so people and nature can thrive. And over the past 20 years that NatCap has been around, we've worked in over 70 countries to bring information on the values of nature into decision making by governments, communities, NGOs, and companies. And we also provide free open source geospatial software for mapping and quantifying values of nature. My personal background is in plant ecology and conservation biology and anthropology. But in this work, I get to work with engineers and policymakers and economists and software developers and all sorts of people. So it's an exciting place to be, all in service of illuminating the values of nature on which we all depend. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. And now I'll turn it over to Rafael Schmitt. Rafael is an assistant professor of environmental studies at UC Santa Barbara. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Jen. Also from my side, thank you very much for organizing this seminar here, to all our colleagues at CCST and for everybody who joined this briefing today. My background is in civil and environmental engineering, and I also hold a PhD in computer science. I used to be, for a long time, a colleague of Lisa and the others speakers from the Natural Capital Project before joining UCSB as an assistant professor a couple of years ago. My lab here that I'm currently building at UCSB is the Lab for River System Science and Sustainability. And I hope the name is somewhat self-explanatory, but what me and my postdocs and PhD students really aim to elucidate are the intrinsic links between river systems as connectors in landscapes, in natural processes, but also between natural systems and human systems. We do work a lot on sustainable water infrastructure planning. We do work a lot on understanding the role of rivers for the water, energy, food, and ecosystem nexus, and also work on highlighting their role for climate mitigation and adaptation. And we do so focusing both on California, but also on many big rivers around the world.
Thanks, Rafael. And last but not least, we have Tong Wu, who is from Stanford University. Tong?
Thank you, Jen, and many thanks to our colleagues at CCST for organizing this webinar. My name is Tong Wu. I'm a senior scientist at the Natural Capital Alliance. My academic background is interdisciplinary, but I primarily come from an economics, the kind of research and education. But in recent years, we've tried to advance a very interdisciplinary approach to tie ecological science to techniques of economic valuation to bring and reveal and institutionalize the many benefits that nature provides to people. And in particular, over the past several years, I've been working on advancing an indicator called Gross Ecosystem Product, or GEP, which I think I'll have a chance to discuss later. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. So, throughout this conversation and throughout the next hour, please submit questions using the Q&A feature. And there's many of us behind the scenes that will be sorting through all of those questions, but we really want to hear from folks on the line about what you are curious about and what you want to learn about. We have a few teed up, so I'll start, but then please keep submitting your questions as well. So just to kind of get us all oriented, and for those in the audience who may not be familiar with natural capital or this framework of natural capital assessments and accounting, how would you explain what natural capital assessments and accounting tells us that maybe conventional environmental impact assessments or cost-benefit analyses don't? And whoever wants to start, and I hope there can be some dialogue across you all as well.
I'm happy to start and welcome others to jump in after me. I think well, first of all, I'll say that the natural capital accounting and assessment, or natural capital approaches in general, I think are very consistent with the goals of environmental impact assessment and cost benefit analysis, and other mechanisms. But I think what a natural capital sort of lens brings that's often missing is an explicit accounting for, or yeah, of what happens, when ecosystems are lost or degraded, or when species are impacted, what translating that into what does that mean for human well-being or for our economy. So, for example, it's not just a matter of, okay, this much forest has been converted to other uses, but what does that mean in terms of, for example, water purification, and then potentially impacts to drinking water quality, or costs that will now need to be spent to clean water in order to provide it for drinking, or dredging of reservoirs that wouldn't have had to happen if those ecosystems had been intact and functioning.
If I can just follow up on what Lisa just said, and emphasize the kind of why the capital part of natural capital. So this is, why we do economic valuation. I mean, we know that nature provides many very critical benefits to society. Lisa mentioned many of those. But much, or I would say even most of those benefits, what we call ecosystem services, are not captured by existing economic metrics and markets. And the importance of revealing the economic value of those benefits, an analogy may be similar to like infrared. It's like economic value, but it's like invisible economic. It's like infra value, right? We feel the heat, but we don't see it on our visible spectrum. And so part of this natural capital assessment and accounting is to make visible the economic value that's, the conventional metrics and markets don't yet capture.
Yeah, and from my perspective, Jenn, you mentioned commonly used environmental impact assessments, cost benefits analysis and such, right? And I think one really novel aspect of the entire NCAA approach, the kind of like system scale that many of the work that the Natural Capital Project has pioneered and that others are now taking up, right? I mean, often what we see, for instance, when it comes to water infrastructure, environmental impact assessments, are quite local, whereas both their kind of like downstream impacts, but also their dependency on like entire upstream watersheds act on much bigger scales than what is typically considered in an EIA, for instance. And I think that's just having this kind of like system scale perspective is beyond like all the economic innovation that Tong and Lisa mentioned. I think a really important aspect of NCAA approaches.
Great. Thank you all for that grounding. I spent a little bit of time on the NatCap website before this too, and I found some of your reference materials about the assessments was really helpful in kind of helping us understand this, and both the natural capital assessments and natural capital accounting, to your point, Tom. So really, really appreciate that framing. And now for kind of another question that I'd love to hear from all of you about is, when we are framing natural capital as infrastructure, where do you think this analogy holds up really or particularly well, and where does it start to break down? And then how do each of you think about the difference between investing in a wetland, for example, versus investing in a levee?
I can jump in again. Rafa, Tong. don't make me go first on all of on all of these, but happy to jump in and kick it over to you as well. I think so that yes, there's a lot of ways in which natural capital as infrastructure, that analogy is I think a really useful one, and again gets at illuminating some of these values that nature provides, these benefits that nature provides that are sometimes invisible. So natural systems can provide protection against flooding or mitigate the impacts of flooding, can purify water, the whole host of benefits. And so I think in that sense, it's a great analogy. In many cases, we say that built infrastructure tends to do one thing really well. A difference then with sort of nature-based infrastructure is that it often has co-benefits. So benefits beyond just that sort of one maybe core function that built infrastructure is designed for. So if you're thinking of like wetlands versus levees, wetlands can mitigate flooding. They also can store and sequester carbon. They support, bird populations, bird migration, nursery habitat for fish. They provide recreational opportunities. So a whole host of benefits that you wouldn't necessarily get from a levee or a gray infrastructure. I think where the infrastructure analogy falls short also sort of gets to those co-benefits, that there are benefits from nature as well that are not easily quantified in economic values that are part of what they provide and kind of go beyond nature as infrastructure.
Yeah, following up on that, I think like living in a state like California, where we obviously depend very heavily on like built water infrastructure, on our like reservoirs and levees and canals. The question, in my opinion, is of course not if like natural capital or natural infrastructure can replace this like built environment or this like built infrastructure, but rather how it can complement it, right? I think it's like not realistic to assume that we fully replace the flood control for Sacramento by tearing down the levees and like replacing it with like upstream wetlands, right? But I think there's this kind of like complementary effect that, particularly in a place with like aging infrastructure that's increasingly stressed by climate change, can be complemented, can be helped by upstream nature-based solutions, restoring wetlands, increasing floodplain to channel connectivity, and such. And probably coming to the question, okay, so where does this analogy fall short? I think what we need for planning and designing around natural infrastructure is, of course, also being open to change, right? Because like natural systems are kind of like by definition dynamic, right? So in that sense, they behave very differently. Let's say like from building a dam, and then the dam sits there for like 100 years with like given design specifications and so on. A natural floodplain will always be open to change, and I think as decision makers, but also stakeholders in these infrastructure decisions, we need to change a little bit like how we basically look at them and how much change we are willing to allow in these like nature-based alternatives to gray infrastructure.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on what Lisa and Rafa just said on 2 points. One is Lisa's point of co-benefits, and also Rafa's point, in the sense that we're not proposing that natural capital is a perfect substitute for built capital, or that nature-based infrastructure should be a perfect substitute for gray infrastructure. What we're advocating for is something more like increasing the share of natural capital in your portfolio of capital. Like Rafa mentioned, built capital and nature-based capital are complementary in many respects. So we're not nature absolutists in that sense. We're just, advancing a vision where we think the proportion of natural capital should be increased because it's woefully underrepresented in most decision makers' public investment portfolios. And on the point of co-benefits, I can just identify two very brief cases. I work mostly in the Asia Pacific region. And in certain cases, for instance, in Indonesia, we know mangroves are extremely important infrastructure in the sense that they mitigate the impacts of storms and storm surges, but they also serve as nurseries for fish. So they sustain the fishing communities. They're a source of a sink for blue carbon. And then, of course, there's also a lot of these aesthetic benefits that aren't necessarily easily captured in conventional economic metrics. Lisa mentioned there are habitats for birds. There are a lot of very tangible and very readily calculable economic benefits, but there's also these additional benefits. And, a city that's encased in cement versus a city that has a healthy mix of green and gray and blue infrastructure are obviously different, not just in economic terms, but in cultural and social and spiritual terms.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I'm sure we'll get to that as how do we prioritize those benefits too, as we're talking about this throughout the conversation. So you all sort of touched on this, and Lisa, I know you teed this up really well in your comments, but California obviously faces a lot of different climate risks, often overlapping, often sort of additive or cumulative, including, of course, heat and flood and drought and fire and coastal erosion, and often in the same communities. So are there natural capital investments that address multiple risks at once, or do we need to be thinking about these separately? And as you're sharing, I'd love to hear too about, projects or some of those investments that you think are really, great examples of this.
Well, I can take the first step at this, from the perspective of like water resources, right? As you know, as everybody in the audience knows, and Jenn, as you mentioned as well, I mean, California faces like tremendous challenges going ahead, and like two of the major threats that come up in like our everyday lives in the media and unfortunately have impacted many of us also directly, right? It's like fires and hydrologic risks such as like drought and flood, right? And when we think about natural capital assessments that actually play this multifunctional role, as Lisa said before, in mitigating these hydrologic and fire hazards, then what comes immediately to mind are like natural floodplains, right? There's like plenty of evidence showing that natural floodplains that are like well connected to a river, that are kept moist by the river, create very effective like fire breaks in case of a fire. But they do also provide hydrologic storage, as basically the ability of the river to spread out on the floodplain allows the water to percolate and then being released more slowly going downstream. So I think that's something that comes immediately to mind. And something we are actually, like California has done a lot of like pioneering work, working on like meadow restoration, working on like beaver dam analogs and so on, to really deploy these kind of like nature-based solutions, individually very small, but like deploying them on kind of like a really large and kind of like system scale. And I think this could be a really good example for NCAA natural capital assessment and evaluation approaches in order to understand which benefits these individual projects cumulatively provide for the state.
Yeah, I guess I'll build on that a bit to say, there's clearly like no silver bullet. It's not like, oh, just build this wetland here, like restore this wetland here, and it will solve all our climate mitigation, climate adaptation problems. But nature-based solutions definitely need to be an important part of the strategy. And I think thinking about, given the multiple benefits that nature-based approaches can provide, then there's benefits to thinking kind of holistically, even if it's going to require different strategies, including gray infrastructure to get to where we want to be. And I guess for another example, just thinking about green spaces and nature in cities. I live in San Francisco, and there have been an increasing number of parks that have been renovated to bring more green space into the parks and nature-based elements that are designed then to absorb, stormwater runoff or water with sea level rise, coastal flooding, but then obviously provides like recreational benefits. And we know that those green spaces provide mental health benefits to people who spend time in them. It increases people's physical activity. Exposure to nature is good for kids' immune system. So there's a whole host of reasons for why those green spaces can be useful, both for climate related reasons and benefits beyond. green spaces in cities also can reduce temperature. That's less an issue in San Francisco than in other parts of the state. And as an example, I'll place in the chat here, and maybe folks can share with the audience. A few years back, we worked with San Mateo County in California that really wanted to understand how nature-based solutions could be part of their coastal management planning for sea level rise, and thinking about the co-benefits. They developed kind of plans and opportunities for different regions within the county. So I think that's a good example of how at the county level this has been tackled.
Sure, and again, I'll just kind of underscore what Rafa and Lisa have said by emphasizing, I think that when we say natural capital, when we say ecosystem services, by capital and services, we do mean capital and services. We're not just using this in a metaphorical sense, because what a lot of our work, most of our work, from the science, the research, to the development of scientific models, to the translation into tools, software for use by urban planners or by people who manage investment, is that we really demonstrate the functional, either the functional equivalence or the functional improvement that using nature or nature-based solutions has over more conventional or built approaches. Now, as was mentioned earlier, it's not in every situation where the nature-based approach is going to be superior. But in many cases, it will be. And in many cases, it will be complementary to built or engineered approaches. And so I think, until now, we haven't, in most parts of the world, we haven't treated nature and ecosystems as capital, as a productive asset that provides services. And so, a lot of our work across the world is to highlight these very informative and scalable examples and case studies. Lisa and Rafa mentioned two. I'll just highlight another one, again, from the Asia Pacific region. For instance, people know this thing called the Great Green Wall. It's a colloquial name for a very large-scale ecological restoration, afforestation, and reforestation project across the North China Plain in order to mitigate sandstorms. Sandstorms for a while were kind of the, sandstorms to, Eurasia, or what kind of wildfires out to North America, a major public health hazard. It brings economic activity to a standstill. And only through afforestation, reforestation, that was the most cost-effective, but also the most scalable approach to managing that challenge. And so there's, whether we're planting, millions of acres of forest, or whether we're investing in parks in cities, we really emphasize the functional benefits. We're not, when we say these are services and it's capital and there are benefits, it's not, we're not gilding, a conventional approach to conservation. We really want to demonstrate how it provides these economically valuable benefits.
Great. Thanks, Tong. And sort of on that note, and somewhat related, you've mentioned you've done a lot of work on a framework called the Gross Ecosystem Product, largely in these international settings. So in a nutshell, Tong, can you tell us what is Gross Ecosystem Product and what lessons like a state like California can learn from this framework?
Sure. Gross Ecosystem Product, or GEP, it's something that NatCap has been working on for the past 10 years with international partners in Asia and Europe, and increasingly with multilateral development banks like the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, Inter-America Development Bank. GEP is defined as the aggregate economic value of final ecosystem services produced within a given region. Many of the services that Lisa and Rafa mentioned, hydrological services, health services, but also nature as infrastructure. So, mangroves that mitigate storm impacts, green spaces that cool cities. We aggregate that into one economic indicator. And that becomes, in many of the places where we worked, much more actionable than presenting decision makers and investors with a spreadsheet of all the diverse benefits that we are able to identify. We lose a lot in the process, but we also gain a lot in terms of pragmatic implementation and uptake. We work, GEPs gain traction in many countries, especially in Asia, but also I'm happy to report that a few weeks ago, the U.S. Council of Mayors, which I understand is a very large and influential association of local governments, they put out a report on on resilient cities and how to reduce natural disaster impacts. And they highlighted GEP as a potential policy tool that can be scaled within the US to help cities become more resilient and sustainable and to stimulate green growth, attract green finance, so on and so forth. So yeah, we think it's gaining traction.
That's super exciting. We'll have to dig up that report and see if we can send it around to folks, but that's a huge milestone. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, we're getting some great questions in from the audience, and everyone on the line, as you have any questions for our speakers here and our experts, please keep using the Q&A feature. But we have a question from Emmanuel, who's at Department of Water Resources with the state of California. So when we frame natural capital as infrastructure, we often measure its value through avoided damages, ecosystem service, and long-term cost savings. How can California make sure equity is built into those investment decisions from the beginning so that disadvantaged communities and climate vulnerable communities are not just secondary beneficiaries, but are prioritized in project selection, design, governance, maintenance, and the distribution of benefits? So thoughts there from any and all of you?
Yeah, that's a really important point that just representing the economic value or the total benefits of ecosystems won't necessarily address equity issues that are important as well. And there are a number of different ways that equity can be brought in, from the start. So in many of these approaches, especially when we start thinking about, spatially, like where ecosystems are located, where maybe disadvantaged communities are located, and what is the relationship between these different investment opportunities and who will receive the benefits, that can all be modeled and quantified and sort of built into understanding what are the costs and benefits. So not just total costs and benefits, but costs and benefits to different groups. And also I think it's important to say that these different groups need to have a seat at the table when these decisions are getting made in terms of what are the values of nature that are important to consider, especially, there are cultural values, spiritual values, a whole host of values that are not easily wrapped into that, like a headline economic value, that are important to be factored in as well. So it's important to consider those equity dimensions from the start, and it can be built into the processes for quantifying and representing the values and the trade-offs or opportunities associated with different options. For one example, outside of California, but we did work with the city of San Antonio, where they wanted to transform, I think, abandoned lots into green space that really would provide benefits in an equitable way. They were thinking about creating food forests, so greening spaces with trees and other vegetation that could provide fruit and food and supplement food for food insecure people. And also those green spaces would provide cooling benefits. So looking at sort of where in the cities are those benefits most needed? Where are there communities that are food insecure that could benefit? Where are there communities that are particularly impacted by heat and don't have other, as many options for cooling their temperatures? And so that could all be built into deciding, okay, where are the benefits of investing in these food forests, for example, the greatest?
I can also just jump in very briefly on the equity point. I think a lot of ecosystem services are public goods. And so Lisa mentioned earlier health. We're doing a lot of work on mental health and physical health and how urban nature provides those benefits. Mental health especially, we know it's, whether in the United States, but especially in many other parts of the world, mental health provision is lacking and it's very expensive. And so that's obviously a barrier to healthcare for a lot of people who don't have the financial resources. But if we invest in urban green space, public parks, what our studies over the past several years have found is that there is a very significant effect that regular access and exposure to nature has on depression and anxiety. Now that doesn't mean that spending a half an hour a day in a park can substitute for pharmaceutical or professional doctoral care. But at the population level, it can have significant public health benefits, and it's a public good. And so, things like that, I think, definitely have an equity dimension to it.
Yeah, and probably like to add like a tiny additional angle here, right? I mean, Tong and Lisa talked a lot about like who receives ecosystem services, right? And of course, very important to do investments, let's say like in, you know, urban green spaces or like flood protection in a way that it benefits particularly like disadvantaged communities, really critical. But I think another really important aspect of equity is not only to think about like who receives these kind of like ecosystem services, but also who kind of like generates them, or like, whose land kind of like generates them, right? Like in many parts of the world, we have a situation where we have actually, for instance, indigenous stewards of the land, whose lands create numerous benefits for downstream communities, for downstream industries, for downstream cities. But often these stewards of the land are not actually really compensated for the work they do. And I think that's a major equity problem. And because of this kind of like system scale perspective that we take with these NCAAs, they provide actually a quite powerful tool to highlight the contributions of these land stewards and make sure that they actually get the recognition and potentially also financial compensation for all the work that they do for the greater good.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's just also such an important point you all said is, making sure we're having those conversations with the most climate vulnerable communities first and foremost, and them really helping shape what are the needs, what are the challenges before, just entering a community supposing what is needed. So I think that's an important undercurrent in all of your comments. So we have another audience question from Chris Trinnell. And Chris says, it's well established that natural capital projects often bring multiple benefits. However, these broadened public benefits are often not enough to nudge project design decision-making towards the natural capital approach, especially when public funding agencies are constrained by their relatively narrow missions or when the dollars themselves are restricted to specific purposes. On top of this, multi-benefit projects can often be more expensive than single-purpose efforts, further disincentivizing the effort needed to tackle multifaceted projects. What are your recommendations for nurturing a governmental culture that prioritizes collaborative project design and co-financing across multiple agencies? Great question and a lot in there. So would love your thoughts on that. I know we have lots of different state agencies on the line that are thinking about, these big infrastructure investments, and also really, to Chris's point, really trying to think about collaboration across department and agency boundaries too.
I guess I can be the first one this time. I guess again, just to draw upon our experience internationally, one country that we worked in quite extensively and intensively over the past several years is Chile. And so Chile established something called the National Natural Capital Committee. That's across ministry, across agency organization. It's that was chaired. Some of you may know they've had a recent change of government, but it was chaired by a vice minister level, official who coordinated regular meetings between different agency and ministerial representatives to advance cross-cutting initiatives and to align and potentially even pool financial resources to target investments and policies that benefit or meet the kind of the goals of all the different agencies. And so, as organization set up like that, obviously it was quite effective in Chile. But there's just kind of similar governance innovations that we've seen in other parts of the world.
Yeah, building on that, what you said, Tong. I mean, the examples that I can think of also come from national level governments in other countries, but I mean, California is the seventh largest economy anyway in the world, or anyway, California. In many ways, I think this would probably be relevant to California as a state as well. Um, but like in Chile, I've been working with the government of Colombia, which also recently had some change, some elections, but in Colombia as well, the Department of National Planning um, was able to look sort of thinks across different sectors and was able to bring together um, different groups to understand what ecosystem service benefits are. They had a particular policy actually that required them to look at flows of benefits from sort of like less developed or less wealthy regions of the country to the wealthier cities, and to use that as a basis for trying to design financial flows. So I think that sort of that policy mandate then sort of forced the right people to come together to look at what are these benefits, and then how do we how can we work across different government agencies to bring nature-based approaches into more of what they do. So I think, yeah, I don't know how to like spark that, but I think that initial sort of high level support is often really important, and then having thinking across sectors is really helps show how many different sort of stakeholders or agencies or sectors really have a stake in what in the benefits that nature is providing. And then sort of seeing that can be a first step towards finding ways to collaborate or even to like share the data that's needed and sometimes siloed in different places to be able to start moving these efforts forward.
And you're probably also thinking about this, it's a little bit of like a hen and egg problem, right? Like in a way, like, state, local governments create the demand or need to create the demand for these like nature-based solutions. And like Lisa and Tong talked to that, right? But we also need the professionals, consulting companies, implementation, construction companies who actually can offer really like putting these kind of like nature-based solutions like on the ground, right? And we had a project that I found quite interesting, with like Lisa actually also closely involved in that, working with the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, or FIDIC, basically developing kind of like a playbook of how the world's leading consulting engineering firms actually have already worked on these kind of like nature-based solution projects, and just also creating kind of like on the side of these kind of consultants and like service providers, more of kind of like awareness that these solutions actually do exist. And can also open a quite interesting additional revenue stream for them. And we got really good like feedback and response actually from the members of this association. So I think that was a quite an additional interesting angle of how we can approach this kind of like implementation gap.
Thanks. So the next question sort of builds on Chris's, and it's something I've been thinking about throughout this conversation too. So when we're placing a valuation on ecosystems and ecosystem services, we know that that can reach many audiences, but are we losing anything or overlooking anything when nature is treated largely in transactional terms? So something I want to get to is one of your points early on, Tong, about, we're really thinking about nature as capital and assets, but there's also these other benefits, right? The well-being, the social benefits, the mental health benefits. So how do we kind of bridge what Chris was talking about these other benefits that are hard to maybe value when there's a, mandate of a state agency? But then what also happens when we think about nature in just these kind of transactional terms, and are we losing anything? So would love to have you all, and it's not an easy question, obviously, but would love any of your thoughts on that as we also reflect on Chris's question too.
Maybe I can go first again, just because it's kind of coming from more from an economics background. And again, at NatCap, we've been, how should I put it delicately? We've been fighting this fight for a while, or making the economic case for nature, while at the same time emphasizing that we're not trying to trivialize nature, because we understand that nature is imbued with so many diverse meanings and values that cannot be ever captured by economic methods, no matter how advanced they are. But at the same time, we also recognize that pragmatically, uh, in the world of finance and policy, and especially in, for instance, developing countries, but also in advanced economies as well, the difference between treating nature as something that's priceless and treating nature as something that's worthless is actually on the ground, that line we find is quite thin and can easily be trespassed if we have a lot of vested interest, or people who have a desperate need for development, or are facing or economic pressures of all kinds. When we put an economic value on nature, we're not putting a ceiling on the value of nature, we're putting a floor, right? And we always emphasize that these are conservative estimates, and they by no means capture all these diverse meanings and values that nature represents. But we are in, I think, an intensifying planetary crisis. One of our colleagues, says that we're in the midst of a great degradation, because even as built capital and all these other kinds of capital have been increasing, natural capital across the world has been crashing, and we need to stop that trend and reverse that trend in order to achieve anything like sustainable development. And why we do natural capital assessment accounting, gross ecosystem product, is to try to arrest that fall, that downward trend. And so again, we're putting a ceiling we're not putting a floor on the value of nature by using these economic approaches.
Yeah, you said that really well, Tong. And I think, as you were alluding to, like in so many of the influential sort of decision-making processes in the world and the systems that we operate in, the values of nature have been assumed to be essentially zero. And so being able to put, as you're saying, Tong, like a lower economic estimate on some of those values can be useful for bringing along both those economic values and the other values that are not quantifiable in that way into decisions. That being said, yes, I think that there is. This is something I think about a lot, but we like change. At the same time, I think many of us would like to see the way that decisions are made, and the systems in which, the ways that these costs and benefits are accounted for that to change as well. And it's also true many decisions are not made solely on an economic basis. Like when you go to vote, on all the different sort of like bond measures that might be on the ballot. For many people, economics is part of it, but there are, values beyond the economic values that factor into those decisions as well. And I think a natural capital approach, it's not just about, putting a dollar value on nature. It's about representing multiple values of nature in different ways to capture that in a way that we can make decisions, have discussions, have it be visible in a way that it was not before.
Yeah, really, really good answers. I don't think I have like much to add to that, but indeed, I think Tong, what you said really resonated with me. I mean, like it's the floor, right? So like, like nobody claims to like, fully represent all the values that like a certain ecosystem or ecosystem type can provide, right? It's like always kind of like a snapshot of like some subset of like services, right? And I also don't think that like valuing or like trying to put like an economic valuation on nature necessarily means that we will only treat it as kind of like an economic resource. It is just kind of like, so to say, like a unit conversion to make sure that different people speak in kind of like the same terms and have like the kind of like comparable metrics in front of them when it comes to decision making.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Rafael, too. It's not just because we're valuing it in these economic terms does not mean the only way it's valued, right? And also, I love this discussion of a floor and a ceiling, and what the boundaries of these estimates, right? And how do we caveat that, or how do we explain that as we are providing an economic estimate, right? So maybe that could kind of help bridge those two questions we've just gotten from the audience a bit. Okay, we have kind of an exciting applied question or for our next one. So this is from Barbara, and she lives in the Tulare Basin. Barbara's tried to make the argument that reconnecting rivers to their floodplains is preferable to using on-farm recharge basins for the purpose of groundwater recharge and flood risk reduction. However, Barbara's lacking an economic benefit argument. So how can I go about putting that together, given you all are obviously experts, but also really supporting different regions and governments around the world? I thought you might have some interesting ideas or solutions for Barbara.
I can have a first go, I think, or Lisa, you go first.
No, please go ahead, Rafa.
No, I think in California, you need like all the recharge you can get, basically, particularly with like our dwindling like snowpack. I think when it comes to like natural floodplains, like one aspect that could be considered there really prominently, it's not only the benefits for like local groundwater recharge or like downstream flood protection, but it's also the really clear measurable benefits, for instance, for carbon sequestration or helping the state to reach like certain biodiversity commitments, right? That would be probably one of the first aspects I would look into. I mean, another step I would take is probably also just kind of like an order of magnitude comparison to like, how do kind of like the area of floodplain, of natural floodplain that could be used to like store and absorb these floodwaters actually compare to the area of like farmland where farmers are actually willing to engage in these practices, grow crops that are compatible with it, and so on.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So it's not an either or necessarily, and it's also about thinking about the connection when we're, thinking about floodplain management and restoration to our biodiversity goals across the state. So super helpful. Okay, if there's nothing else from Lisa or Tong, I think we have time for one or two more. So this question is from Clessie Bennett, who works at the California Natural Resources Agency and is a close colleague of mine. So Clessie asks, do you see a role for natural capital assessments or ecosystem service valuations to catalyze private investment and financing? And if so, how?
I can get started on this one if others want to jump off. I mean there is so much talk and desire for directing private finance towards nature. And I was part of there's this intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, sort of the equivalent of the IPCC for nature. And I was an expert on that. There was a business and biodiversity assessment that was just approved in plenary in February, so I can share a link to that for anybody who wants to like really get into the details. I think there's a few ways that I see that yes, this information can drive private investment or private financial flows. One is helping companies realize their dependencies on nature or their supply chain dependencies on nature for commodities that depend on, say, pollination or soil health or water resources. Water risk is a big one, and so some of that I think has driven companies to sort of invest in their own operations and their own supply chains on nature-based approaches. There's also a limit to how far that will get us in terms of where we might like to be in terms of investments of nature. There are regulatory markets like wetland mitigation, habitat mitigation banking, where government policy sets certain requirements, and then that drives private investments to meet compliance with those regulations as well. There are some interesting examples in California. Actually, the Blue Forest Conservation has developed these forest resilience bonds, where basically there's forest restoration that economically makes sense to do at a societal level, but the either the landowners, which I think sometimes are government landowners, don't have the resources to do that restoration, which would actually drive downstream benefits in terms of like reduced fire risk, improved water quality. And so they've created some interesting financial mechanisms that involve private financial flows to invest in restoration as well.
Yes, and I'll just build on what Lisa said about kind of the supply chain, the country, just the example of a potential frontier is, nature provides such a systematic contribution, as Rafa was mentioning, upstream, literally, and also figuratively, in any sense of economic activities, other economic activities. And I guess an analogy would be, 2 years ago, most people didn't know what rare earths were, right? You could find Bloomberg columnists saying, rare earths aren't that rare. The market's only $10 billion. But now, of course, now that we have, through various tribulations, have come to recognize how important rare earths are to a whole range of industrial and processes and economic activities. Now, now markets just, investment has poured into the rare earth industry. I mean, nature provides a similarly critical, we have critical minerals, we have critical nature, critical ecosystems that are upstream and systematically important to so many other economic activities. And I think right now we're only at the beginning of recognizing, and part of our job, we think, at NatCap is to make the world more aware of the systematic importance of nature. And so to drive investment in critical nature, in upstream natural capital, before we have our rare earths moment. And if we get to the point where, we only recognize the value, the systematic economic importance of nature when we don't have enough of it, then, at that point we're going to be in a crisis. And so I think that's a new frontier for finance is, that's a bigger mission. That's more of a changing the discourse and the culture of investment in finance, changing the mindset of how people think about nature. But I was at a meeting several weeks ago of international financial institutions, and the chief investment officer for one of these multilateral development banks said, we're now beginning to treat nature as an emerging asset class. And so I think we're seeing some of these changes, but it will involve changing mindsets as well as changing technologies and tools.
Yeah, that's a great segue to our last question. And I think if we just have, a couple words from each of you, that what are you most excited for or hopeful now? And then I'll hand it back to John to close us out.
I guess having worked with, sort of in the space for I think nearly 15 years, it really does feel like we're at an inflection point where there is greater appreciation across levels, different governments, levels of government, of how important nature is. And the question is, okay, so what do we do about it? I think where there's a will, there's a way. So, we have the tools, we have the science, we have people who are, who understand and believe in this. So I feel optimistic, about where we are.
That's great. Rafael?
Yeah, with less experience than Lisa, but I think it's it's for my experience in the space, I totally support this idea of the inflection point, right? It seems to have moved from the stage where we needed to provide like more evidence and like more research that like natural capital is actually relevant, ecosystem services are actually relevant, and like these kind of like nature focused investments do actually provide tangible benefits, actually to a stage where there's a really growing demand. And now it's a lot about really like implementation, like how do we create the kind of like socioeconomic and government systems and bring stakeholders on board that will make these investments actually possible going forward, because there's this great momentum and understanding that this will be critical for climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and like many other environmental challenges we are facing.
Great, thanks. And Tong, couple words on what you're most excited or hopeful for.
Yeah, I think I just have to not second, third the inflection point. And I think we all get the sense that after working on this for so long, we are in the midst of a pretty positive and radical transformation. And I think that's part of a larger shift in the culture or in society, where people are recognizing that there are the sources and the sources and meaning of economic value is changing. I mean, I feel vaguely heretical saying this coming from, I'm sitting in Silicon Valley, but in a world where, the value of cryptocurrency and artificial intelligence is readily accepted, then, for us, advancing, the argument that nature, the most fundamental and tangible thing in our world, has economic value. I think, we're going to try to advance that argument and say, in this brave new world that we're living in, it's not just digital, innovations that have economic value. It's these, earthly things in our world that have economic value as well.
Well, thank you all for sharing your insights and ideas. I'll hand it off to John to close us out. And thanks again.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. Thanks. It was a great discussion. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Jenn for doing such a great job moderating. And thanks to everyone for attending and asking such great questions. As I mentioned in the Q&A, there'll be a video of this briefing available that'll get posted on our website shortly after this. So if you want to check it again, or you have a colleague who wasn't able to attend, please feel free to share it with them. And stay tuned for more information about events from CCST, like our 4th annual Science Day, which will be happening in partnership with the Natural Resources Agency in October. I hope everyone has a great day, and thanks so much for taking the time to join in.